7 loggers were executed over a broken timber contract. Over one October weekend in the Missouri Ozarks, 7 men died, and for years everyone knew why, but no one would say who pulled the trigger. Long before investigators began sorting through faded reports and forgotten evidence boxes. Before old timber records became exhibits and cold case detectives retraced roads that had almost disappeared beneath brush and fallen leaves, there was only the Ozarks themselves. In the late 1980s, the hills of southern Missouri were beautiful from a distance, but they could become unforgiving the moment someone stepped away from the pavement. Thick oak forests stretched across steep ridges and narrow valleys. Gravel roads twisted through miles of isolated timberland, and entire communities lived farther from the nearest courthouse than many people lived from another state. It was a place where weather changed quickly. Radio signals disappeared without warning, and a truck breaking down after sunset could leave a driver stranded until morning. Logging had shaped much of the region for generations. Families cut timber not simply because it was profitable, but because it was what fathers had taught sons, and what grandfathers had taught fathers before them. White oak, red oak, walnut, and shortleaf pine were more than trees. They were mortgages, truck payments, medical bills, college savings that rarely became college funds. Every load hauled out of the mountains represented weeks of labor, careful planning, and substantial financial risk. By the autumn of 1988, the timber market remained strong enough that a productive crew could earn significant income during a successful season, particularly when harvesting hardwood tracts contracted for commercial mills. Individual timber rights were often valued in the tens of thousands of dollars, and a disputed boundary line or competing claim could determine whether one family prospered while another struggled through the winter. Yet, despite the money involved, much of the business still depended on trust. Formal contracts certainly existed, especially when larger companies became involved, but countless smaller operations continued to function through verbal agreements, handwritten notes folded inside pickup truck dashboards, or promises exchanged over diner coffee before sunrise. A man's reputation often carried more weight than a lawyer's signature. Breaking one's word carried consequences that rarely appeared inside courtrooms. The law existed. Everyone understood that. But many disputes reached their conclusion long before a sheriff ever heard about them. The Ozarks had developed their own unwritten code over generations. Families remembered favors for decades. They remembered insults even longer. Outsiders were viewed carefully until they proved themselves, and sometimes they were never fully accepted at all. Property lines were defended with remarkable determination. Hunting grounds remained sensitive subjects. Timber rights could divide neighbors who had attended the same church for 30 years. Most disagreements stopped at angry conversations. Some did not. County sheriff's departments faced enormous practical challenges. A handful of deputies often patrolled hundreds of square miles, filled with narrow logging roads, abandoned mining trails, creek crossings, and private land that could not easily be searched without cause. A deputy responding to a disturbance might spend nearly an hour driving to a location, only to discover that everyone involved had already disappeared back into the woods. Investigators would later describe this geography as one of the greatest obstacles facing rural law enforcement. Distance slowed everything. Evidence vanished quickly. Witnesses often knew one another through family connections, business relationships, or shared history that extended back generations. Silence became its own form of protection. Several miles beyond one particularly isolated stretch of gravel roadway sat a temporary logging operation known locally as Camp Hollow Ridge. It was not marked on most maps. The camp consisted of little more than equipment trailers, fuel storage, parked logging trucks, portable sleeping tents, and an open clearing where crews gathered each evening after long days cutting timber from the surrounding hillsides. During daylight hours, the constant sound of chainsaws echoed across the valleys, while loaded trucks crawled down mountain grades carrying massive hardwood logs toward regional mills. To someone passing through for the first time, the camp would have appeared ordinary. Hard work, long hours, mud, diesel engines, coffee brewing before sunrise, men returning exhausted after dark. Nothing about it suggested that history would remember the place for anything else. Yet by the beginning of October, according to later investigative findings, Tension had already begun building beneath the routine rhythm of daily work. The logging crew operating from Camp Hollow Ridge had accepted what was expected to be one final contract before the season slowed, despite growing disagreements over ownership rights connected to portions of the timber being harvested. Exactly how those disagreements began remained disputed for years. Some later believed overlapping verbal agreements had created confusion. Others argued that competing financial interests intentionally exploited the lack of written documentation. Whatever the true explanation, the disagreement refused to disappear. Instead, it slowly spread through the camp. At first, the incident seemed too minor to deserve serious attention. Equipment that had been parked carefully before sunset appeared several yards from its original location the following morning. Nothing had been stolen, nothing had been damaged. It simply had not remained where the crew left it. Several workers noticed fresh tire tracks crossing muddy sections of road that no scheduled deliveries were supposed to use. The tracks appeared overnight. No one admitted driving there. One afternoon, while preparing machinery for another day of cutting, a crew member reportedly discovered crude warning words painted across the side of a diesel fuel tank. The message itself was brief. Its meaning was unmistakable. Leave. The paint was eventually scrubbed away. Work continued. According to later accounts, conversations around the evening campfire became shorter after that. Men who usually joked about hunting season or football scores spent longer periods staring into the flames. Pickup headlights appearing on the distant ridgelines attracted immediate attention before disappearing again behind the trees. Dogs occasionally barked into the darkness without obvious reason. No one could prove that these incidents were connected. No one could prove they were not. Some believed the warnings were little more than intimidation, designed to pressure the crew into abandoning the contract voluntarily. Others dismissed them as ordinary disputes exaggerated through rumor. Rural communities often generated stories faster than evidence, and investigators would later struggle to separate genuine warning signs from details added after the tragedy. But one fact became increasingly difficult to ignore. Someone wanted the crew to understand they were being watched. Complaints about the intimidation were reportedly mentioned informally, though nothing developed into a formal criminal case during those early days. The incidents remained isolated, individually explainable, collectively unsettling. No charges were filed. As another weekend approached, Camp Hollow Ridge continued operating, much as it always had. Chainsaws started before dawn. Trucks disappeared into the timber. The campfire burned after sunset beneath an endless canopy of stars. To anyone watching from the surrounding hills, it appeared to be another ordinary logging camp, finishing another ordinary contract. It would not remain ordinary for much longer. By the middle of October 1988, Camp Hollow Ridge had developed the quiet rhythm that most temporary logging camps eventually found. Before sunrise, coffee boiled over portable burners, while diesel engines warmed against the cool mountain air. By first light, chainsaws echoed through the valleys, and by evening, the 7 men who worked the contract gathered around the same fire, eating simple meals before turning in for another day that was expected to look almost exactly like the one before it. That routine, more than anything else, created the illusion that the growing tension surrounding the disputed timber rights could somehow remain outside the boundaries of the camp. At the center of the crew stood Harold Hal Mercer, a 46-year-old foreman whose reputation had been built over more than 2 decades in the Ozark timber industry. According to later accounts from people who had worked alongside him, Harold trusted hard. Work, careful records, and measurable facts far more than promises. While many foremen relied on memory or verbal tallies at the end of the day, Harold carried a worn leather notebook in the chest pocket of his work jacket. Every truckload was recorded. Every estimated board foot count was written down. Every delivery, payment expectation, and work assignment found its way onto those pages. The notebook had become so familiar that several workers later admitted they could hardly remember seeing Harold without it. The habit occasionally irritated buyers who preferred informal accounting, but Harold rarely apologized for it. Timber values changed quickly, contracts became complicated, and misunderstandings could become expensive. Written records, he believed, protected everyone involved. He had another reason to be careful. According to family members interviewed years later, Harold planned to retire the following spring. After decades spent cutting timber in every season imaginable, he hoped this final stretch of contracts would allow him to leave the business with enough savings to spend more time at home. Retirement was no longer an abstract dream. It had become a date quietly marked in his own mind. If Harold represented experience, Dennis Avery represented reliability. At 31 years old, Dennis served as the crew's mechanic, although that description barely captured the role he filled. Whenever a truck refused to start before dawn or hydraulic equipment failed halfway through a workday, Dennis usually solved the problem before anyone suggested calling outside help. He believed machinery deserved patience before replacement, and he approached every repair with a calm confidence that came from years spent taking engines apart, piece by piece. Dennis also carried another habit that seemed unusual to some of the crew. Whenever he discovered fresh dents, damaged equipment, suspicious tire marks, or anything else that appeared out of place, he reached for a disposable camera stored inside the glove compartment of his pickup truck. The photographs served no artistic purpose. They simply documented conditions exactly as they appeared. If questions arose later, Dennis preferred having a photograph rather than relying on memory. He rarely explained why. He simply kept buying new cameras whenever the old ones were used up. Every morning, Dennis followed the same mountain shortcut, leading toward the active cutting area. The route saved nearly 15 minutes compared to the wider logging road, crossing a narrow ridge before descending through older hardwood stands toward the worksite. Other drivers occasionally changed their routes depending on weather conditions, but Dennis almost never did. Familiarity, he believed, reduced unnecessary mistakes. The youngest member of the crew was 24-year-old Wayne Hollis, whose future still stretched far beyond the hills surrounding Camp Hollow Ridge. Wayne had recently become engaged, and according to relatives, much of his spare time was spent planning a life that looked very different from the temporary logging camps where he had spent the previous several years. Every Sunday evening, regardless of where work had taken him, he wrote a handwritten letter home. Sometimes the letters described the forests. Sometimes they mentioned long days cutting oak. Sometimes they contained little more than reassurance that everything remained fine. He never missed a week. Another habit drew occasional good-natured teasing from the older loggers. Wayne refused to leave camp after dark without carrying a heavy hunting flashlight clipped to his belt. Whether walking to parked trucks, checking equipment, or simply crossing the clearing, the flashlight always accompanied him. "Better to have light than wish for it," he reportedly told another worker more than once. The remaining members of the crew completed a group that had learned to depend upon one another through shared routines rather than dramatic friendships. Clifford Dunn had logged throughout southern Missouri long enough to recognize changing weather simply by watching clouds move across the ridges. Larry Boone handled much of the heavy equipment with quiet efficiency, preferring work over conversation whenever possible. Russell Keene possessed the physical strength that allowed him to tackle the most demanding tasks without complaint, while Tommy Raines, though naturally reserved, often became the first person others approached whenever supplies needed organizing or schedules required adjusting. They were not seven strangers brought together by coincidence. They were a working crew built through familiarity, repetition, and mutual dependence. Each man's safety depended upon the judgment of the others. It was precisely that stability that the growing contract disputes slowly began to erode. According to later investigative summaries, the disagreement centered on competing claims involving the harvesting rights attached to portions of the timber surrounding Camp Hollow Ridge. One company maintained that the agreement authorizing the work remained valid. Another claimed ownership through what was described as an earlier understanding that had never been fully documented in writing. Because verbal agreements had remained common throughout parts of the regional timber industry, establishing exactly who possessed legitimate authority became increasingly complicated. The dispute might have remained a civil disagreement had money not become involved. Payments expected after earlier deliveries failed to arrive on schedule. Questions regarding invoices multiplied. Meetings that had initially appeared routine gradually became shorter, quieter, and noticeably more tense. Workers who attended those discussions later described conversations in which no one openly threatened violence, yet almost every sentence carried the unmistakable weight of unfinished business. Harold reportedly continued updating his notebook after each meeting. Dennis quietly photographed equipment whenever he noticed something unusual. Wayne kept writing letters home. None of them appeared willing to abandon the contract. As the delays continued, someone suggested contacting local authorities regarding the increasingly hostile atmosphere surrounding the disputed logging operation. According to later accounts, the concerns received little formal attention. Property disagreements, verbal contracts, and business disputes rarely justified significant intervention unless a specific criminal offense could be established. Without clear evidence of vandalism, assault, or theft, the situation remained largely a private matter. No charges were filed. The dismissal reinforced something many local residents already believed. If this disagreement reached a conclusion, it would likely do so far from a courtroom. One meeting, remembered years later by those who discussed it with investigators, appeared different from the others. Representatives connected to the competing interests gathered to discuss delayed payments and conflicting contract claims. Voices reportedly remained calm throughout most of the conversation. Documents were examined, figures were questioned, no agreement emerged. Then, according to later testimony describing the exchange, one contractor ended the discussion with a sentence that lingered long after everyone had gone home. Some contracts don't end on paper. No one answered. No argument followed. The meeting simply ended. On its own, the statement proved nothing. It was neither an explicit threat nor an admission of criminal intent. Yet, in the weeks that followed, investigators would revisit those words repeatedly, wondering whether they reflected frustration, intimidation, or something far more deliberate. Back at Camp Hollow Ridge, however, work continued as though routine itself might be enough to keep danger at a distance. Harold slipped his leather notebook back into his jacket before climbing into the lead truck each morning. Dennis replaced another used disposable camera with a fresh one inside his pickup. Wayne folded another handwritten letter, sealed the envelope, and clipped his flashlight to his belt before darkness settled across the clearing once again. None of them could have known that the ordinary habits which defined their final days would eventually become some of the most important details investigators ever examined. The first incident was easy to dismiss. According to later investigative summaries, sometime during the second week of October, 1988, one section of perimeter fencing, separating the active logging area from an adjoining tract, was found neatly cut. The wire had not been torn by wildlife or damaged by weather. It had been clipped cleanly, almost methodically, before being folded back just enough for a vehicle or several people to pass through. No equipment appeared to be missing, and no fresh damage could immediately be found beyond the opening itself. A replacement section of fencing was installed before the end of the afternoon, and by sunset, the crew had largely returned to work. Most believed it had been vandalism. A few believed it had been a message. No one could prove either explanation. Only 2 mornings later, another problem emerged. One of the diesel skidders refused to start before daylight. At first, the malfunction seemed mechanical, the sort of inconvenience every logging operation eventually encountered after weeks of continuous use. Dennis Avery opened the fuel system, expecting to find a clogged filter or moisture inside the lines. Instead, according to later accounts, he discovered contamination that investigators would eventually believe had not occurred naturally. The machine required hours of cleaning before it could safely return to service. Dennis did not argue. He did what he always did. He reached into the glove compartment of his pickup, removed another disposable camera, and photographed the damaged fuel components, the surrounding equipment, and the position of every nearby vehicle before beginning repairs. Some of the older loggers teased him for documenting what looked like an ordinary breakdown, but Dennis quietly continued winding the film advance after each photograph. He had developed the habit long before arriving at Camp Hollow Ridge, and he saw no reason to abandon it now. Harold Mercer watched without interruption. When Dennis finished, Harold opened the worn leather notebook that never seemed to leave his jacket pocket and made another careful entry beside that day's work schedule. Neither man realized how significant those habits would eventually become. Word of the damaged equipment reached local authorities through informal channels, and according to later investigative records, a deputy briefly visited the camp to inspect the area. Nothing immediately connected the contaminated fuel to a criminal suspect. No eyewitnesses came forward. No fingerprints were recovered. Without clear evidence identifying who had tampered with the machinery, the incident remained unresolved. No charges were filed. For another day, life returned to routine. Chainsaws started before sunrise. Loaded trucks crawled down the mountain roads. The campfire burned after dark. Then came the gunshots. Shortly after midnight one evening, several members of the crew reportedly awoke to the unmistakable sound of distant rifle fire echoing across the surrounding ridges. Hunting after dark was not unheard of in rural Missouri, particularly during certain seasons, and isolated shots carried remarkable distances through the hills. Standing alone, the sounds meant very little, yet these shots seemed different. According to later testimony, they came in slow, deliberate intervals rather than scattered bursts. One shot, silence, another shot, silence again. Nobody could determine exactly where they originated. Nobody left the tents to investigate. The following morning, no evidence of hunting activity could be found nearby. Again, there was no proof that anyone had intentionally targeted the logging crew. Again, there was no proof that they had not. The pattern continued. Several mornings later, Wayne Hollis stepped outside his sleeping tent before dawn, his heavy hunting flashlight still clipped to his belt despite the approaching sunrise, and immediately noticed impressions pressed into the damp ground surrounding the camp. Fresh boot prints circled several tents before disappearing toward the tree line. They did not appear to belong to members of the crew, although investigators later acknowledged that positively identifying footwear from such impressions proved impossible. Wayne followed the tracks only a short distance before stopping. The forest beyond remained silent. He returned to camp, carrying the flashlight in one hand. For the first time since arriving at Hollow Ridge, he reportedly checked every vehicle before breakfast. Another complaint reached local authorities. Another deputy reportedly examined the area. The footprints could not be dated with certainty. No suspect could be identified. No charges were filed. By now, even the ordinary routines around camp had begun to change. Men who previously left tools lying beside equipment overnight now locked them away whenever possible. Trucks were parked closer together. Conversations became shorter. Every unfamiliar engine sound drew attention. Every pair of headlights, appearing briefly along a distant ridgeline, prompted someone to stop speaking until they disappeared again. The uneasiness no longer came from any single event. It came from all of them together. Then valuable logging chains vanished. Heavy-duty chains used for dragging timber rarely disappeared accidentally. They were expensive, difficult to carry unnoticed, and essential for daily work. When several chains failed to appear where they had been stored the previous evening, frustration quickly replaced confusion. The missing equipment delayed production, increased costs, and deepened suspicions that someone wanted the operation to fail before the contract could be completed. Searches of nearby trails produced nothing. No discarded equipment, no witnesses, no explanation. Another report was made. Another brief investigation followed. No charges were filed. Harold Mercer became noticeably quieter after that. According to coworkers interviewed years later, he spent increasing amounts of time reviewing paperwork after dinner instead of joining conversations around the fire. His leather notebook grew thicker as receipts, handwritten delivery records, and copies of timber load calculations accumulated between its covers. One evening, while comparing those notes with contract paperwork stored inside the equipment trailer, Harold reportedly discovered that several pages connected to the disputed agreement were missing. There was no obvious sign of forced entry. Nothing else had been disturbed. Only those specific documents had disappeared. Investigators would later regard that discovery as potentially significant, although by then, far too much time had passed to reconstruct exactly when the pages vanished or who had removed them. Harold said little. He simply placed the remaining paperwork back inside the notebook and began carrying it with him even more consistently than before. Dennis noticed something else. While driving his usual mountain shortcut toward the cutting area, one cool morning, he observed fresh tire tracks crossing a muddy section of road that should not have contained recent traffic. Instead of driving past them, he stopped the truck, retrieved another disposable camera, and carefully photographed the impressions from several angles before continuing toward camp. According to later investigators, the photographs would eventually become one of the last documented records Dennis created before the violence that followed. Wayne made his own observation later that afternoon. Twice within the same day, unfamiliar pickup trucks reportedly appeared on distant ridgelines, overlooking portions of the logging operation. Neither vehicle approached close enough for license plates to be identified. Both remained visible only briefly before disappearing back onto isolated forest roads. They never entered the camp. They simply watched. That evening, for the first time, the crew openly discussed abandoning the contract altogether. The missing equipment, the damaged machinery, the gunshots, the footprints, the disappearing paperwork, the unknown vehicles. Taken individually, every incident still possessed a reasonable explanation. Together, they no longer felt accidental. Several workers argued that walking away might cost less than remaining. The financial losses could be absorbed. New work would eventually appear elsewhere. According to later recollections, Harold Mercer listened carefully before answering. He acknowledged the risks. He understood the fear. But he also believed abandoning the contract without proof of wrongdoing would surrender months of work and validate intimidation that had never been openly claimed. He refused to leave. The others remained. On what would later become remembered as their final evening together, the atmosphere around Camp Hollow Ridge differed noticeably from every night before it. The campfire still burned in the center of the clearing, but conversation came only in brief exchanges separated by long stretches of silence. Dennis quietly placed another finished camera inside his truck. Harold checked once more that the leather notebook remained safely inside his jacket. Wayne adjusted the hunting flashlight clipped to his belt before looking out toward the dark tree line where the forest swallowed every sound beyond the reach of the firelight. Finally, according to one later account preserved during the investigation, one of the men stared into the darkness surrounding the camp and spoke. Only 4 words. "They're waiting." No one answered. The fire continued burning. Beyond its light, the Ozark woods remained perfectly still. No charges were filed. The evening of the attack began like every other evening the crew had spent at Camp Hollow Ridge. According to later investigative reconstructions, nothing about the final hour before the violence suggested that the routine established over weeks of work was about to end. Supper had been finished, equipment had been parked. The campfire continued burning in the center of the clearing, sending sparks upward into the cool October air, while the surrounding Ozark forest disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of the flames. One by one, conversations faded. The men prepared for another early morning. At approximately 10:47 p.m., the first unusual sound broke the silence. Dogs began barking somewhere beyond the southern tree line. The barking did not last long. It rose suddenly, echoed across the ridge, then stopped almost as quickly as it had begun. According to later investigators, dogs living on nearby rural properties had occasionally reacted to deer, coyotes, or passing vehicles, making the noise easy to dismiss on its own. Inside the camp, no one immediately appeared alarmed. The fire continued to burn. The woods became quiet again. 4 minutes passed. At approximately 10:51 p.m., several members of the crew reportedly heard engines. Not close, not inside the camp, somewhere beyond the trees. The sound resembled pickup trucks moving slowly over gravel roads before fading, then returning again from another direction. Investigators later believed multiple routes could have approached the clearing without immediately becoming visible from the campsite, making it difficult for anyone inside the camp to determine exactly how many vehicles might have been present. The engines stopped, no headlights appeared, the silence returned. 3 more minutes passed. At approximately 10:54 p.m., small points of light reportedly became visible beyond the edge of the timber. Flashlights, one, then another. According to later reconstruction, the lights moved between the trees for only a few moments before disappearing completely, as though whoever carried them had intentionally switched them off before reaching the clearing. Darkness closed over the forest once again. Inside the camp, several men stood from their seats. No one spoke loudly. No one ran. Everyone watched. At approximately 10:56 p.m., voices carried through the trees. Investigators were never able to determine exactly what was said. Later accounts described low conversation rather than shouting, suggesting that whoever remained outside the clearing had little concern about being overheard. The words themselves disappeared beneath distance and the wind moving through the hardwood canopy. The crew waited. Harold Mercer reportedly remained closest to the folding table, where maps, paperwork, and his worn leather notebook rested beside the evening fire. Dennis Avery stood only a short distance from his pickup truck, the same truck whose glove compartment contained several disposable cameras documenting weeks of suspicious activity around Camp Hollow Ridge. Wayne Hollis instinctively reached for the heavy hunting flashlight clipped to his belt, the same flashlight he had carried every evening, despite good-natured teasing from the older loggers. Those ordinary habits, repeated night after night, suddenly became instinct. Then everything changed. At approximately 10:58 p.m., the first gunshot echoed across the clearing. Investigators later believed the shot came from beyond the tree line rather than from inside the camp itself, although darkness and the terrain prevented complete certainty. The camp exploded into movement. Several men turned toward the sound. Others instinctively looked for cover. Harold reached for the leather notebook that had accompanied him through every load calculation and every disputed payment since the contract began. Whether he intended to protect the records or simply grab the nearest personal possession remained unknown, but according to later investigative interpretation, the notebook never left his hand. Dennis moved toward his truck, not toward a weapon, toward the glove compartment, toward the disposable camera he had used to document damaged equipment, tire tracks, and contaminated fuel throughout the previous weeks. Investigators later believed that instinct reflected the same careful habit he had demonstrated throughout the contract. Record what happened, preserve the evidence. Wayne switched on his flashlight. Its bright beam cut briefly through the darkness toward the southern edge of the clearing. Then more gunfire erupted. The beam vanished. According to later forensic interpretation, the violence unfolded rapidly. The exact sequence could never be reconstructed with complete certainty because no surviving eyewitness remained to describe the attack. Investigators instead relied upon physical evidence, the final positions of the victims, and the condition of the campsite to establish a probable timeline. Shots echoed through the trees, then more, voices, movement. The fire continued burning. Equipment stood exactly where it had been parked. Within moments, the clearing that had served as both workplace and temporary home became silent again. The attack was over almost as quickly as it had begun. According to investigators, the surrounding forest absorbed the remaining sounds until nothing could be heard except the crackling campfire and the wind moving through the oak branches overhead. At approximately 11:03 p.m., based upon the later reconstruction of the scene, no further movement remained inside Camp Hollow Ridge. The fire still burned. Coffee sat untouched beside blackened cookware. Folding chairs remained scattered around the clearing, exactly where they had been left during the confusion. 7 men lay motionless around the campsite. Harold Mercer still remained near the area where paperwork had been organized only minutes earlier. The leather notebook that had documented every timber load, every delivery, and every disputed accounting entry had become one of the final objects investigators associated with him. Dennis Avery never had the opportunity to document what happened next. The camera he instinctively reached for during the opening moments of the attack would later become an important focus of the investigation, because investigators believed it might have contained photographs connected to the intimidation campaign that preceded the violence. Wayne Hollis was found near the position where investigators believed he had activated his hunting flashlight. The light that had accompanied him every night at camp had illuminated the darkness only briefly before disappearing forever. Nearby rested Clifford Dunn, Larry Boone, Russell Keene, and Tommy Raines, the remaining members of a crew that had worked together through routine, trust, and shared responsibility until those ordinary routines ended within only a few devastating minutes. According to later investigative theory, the attackers departed immediately after the violence. Tire impressions discovered the following morning suggested vehicles left the area using remote logging roads rather than the primary entrance to the camp, although weather and subsequent activity limited what could ultimately be concluded from the physical evidence alone. No pursuit occurred that night. No emergency call was placed from the camp. The Ozark forest returned to silence. Morning arrived slowly. As daylight spread across Hollow Ridge, smoke still drifted upward from the dying campfire. The clearing appeared strangely undisturbed at first glance. Trucks remained parked. Equipment stood ready for another day's work. Nothing suggested panic from a distance. Only after approaching the fire did the terrible reality become unmistakable. The camp had not been abandoned. It had been left exactly as it was when violence interrupted an ordinary October evening. The clearing stood silent. The fire had gone cold. 7 lives had ended where, only hours earlier, 7 men had believed they were preparing for another day's work. Daylight transformed Camp Hollow Ridge from an isolated logging camp into an active crime scene. But, according to later investigative summaries, the first responding officers immediately recognized that they had arrived after time, weather, and geography had already begun working against them. The clearing itself remained largely intact, yet everything beyond its edges presented enormous challenges. Narrow logging roads stretched for miles in several directions. Tire impressions crossed one another repeatedly. Dense hardwood forest limited visibility to only a few dozen yards in many places. Every hour that passed increased the likelihood that whatever trace evidence remained would disappear beneath ordinary activity or changing weather. The investigation began with urgency. It quickly encountered uncertainty. Investigators photographed the campsite, documented the positions of equipment, collected physical evidence that could still be identified, and attempted to establish a precise timeline for the previous evening. They interviewed neighboring landowners, local mill employees, nearby hunters, and anyone known to have conducted business connected to the disputed timber contract. According to later case reviews, nearly everyone acknowledged hearing rumors about growing tensions surrounding the logging operation. Almost no one admitted knowing anything specific. Before investigators could complete the first comprehensive search of the surrounding roads, rain arrived. It was not unusually heavy by Ozark standards, but it proved significant enough to complicate the investigation. Muddy tire impressions softened, footwear patterns became indistinct. Surfaces capable of preserving small details gradually lost them beneath water, and fresh vehicle traffic, generated by investigators, emergency personnel, and equipment entering the area. According to later forensic assessments, whatever opportunities existed to identify the exact routes used by those responsible narrowed considerably during those first critical hours. Attention soon shifted toward the personal belongings associated with the victims. Several expected items remained exactly where investigators believed they should have been. Others did not. Among the most significant absences was Harold Mercer's leather notebook. Family members and co-workers consistently described the notebook as something Harold carried almost constantly. It contained handwritten timber load calculations, payment records, delivery notes, and documentation connected to the disputed contract. Investigators searched the immediate campsite, nearby vehicles, surrounding brush, and personal effects recovered from the clearing. The notebook could not be located. Whether it had been removed before the attack, taken afterward, or simply misplaced during the confusion, could not initially be determined. According to investigators, however, its disappearance immediately attracted attention because it represented the most complete private record of the financial disagreement surrounding the logging operation. Dennis Avery's disposable camera also failed to appear. Co-workers remembered seeing him photograph damaged equipment, contaminated fuel systems, unusual tire tracks, and other suspicious incidents during the weeks leading up to the attack. Investigators searched his pickup truck repeatedly, expecting to recover either the camera itself or undeveloped film. Neither was found. Those missing photographs quickly became another central question. If Dennis had documented the intimidation campaign unfolding around Camp Hollow Ridge, investigators believed the images might have identified vehicles, individuals, or locations that later became impossible to reconstruct through memory alone. Wayne Hollis's hunting flashlight, however, was recovered. According to later reports, investigators located it near the area where physical evidence suggested he had been standing during the opening moments of the attack. The flashlight itself offered little direct forensic value, yet its location helped investigators estimate movement within the clearing during the final seconds before the violence concluded. It also confirmed what family members had long described, that Wayne had indeed carried the light almost everywhere after sunset. Outside the physical evidence, another obstacle emerged almost immediately: fear. Investigators later acknowledged that many individuals interviewed during the opening weeks appeared genuinely uneasy discussing the contract dispute. Some admitted hearing arguments, others mentioned unfamiliar vehicles seen near the logging operation before the attack. A few hinted that everyone already suspected who might be responsible. Very few agreed to place those suspicions into formal statements. According to later testimony, concern about retaliation spread quickly throughout nearby communities. Logging remained an interconnected industry. Contractors hired the same drivers. Mills purchased from the same crews. Families had known one another for decades. Speaking publicly carried consequences that extended beyond a single investigation. Rumors spread faster than evidence. Some claimed the killings had been ordered over disputed timber rights. Others insisted the attack involved unrelated criminal activity. Still others believed the truth had already become common knowledge among local residents, but would never be repeated inside a courtroom. Investigators carefully examined each possibility. None could be proven. Attention gradually focused upon several individuals connected to the competing contract claims. According to later investigative summaries, attorneys representing those interests advised their clients against extensive public comment, while civil and financial disputes remained unresolved. Meetings ended. Records became difficult to obtain. Conversations that investigators hoped would clarify ownership questions instead produced carefully limited responses. The possibility of a broader conspiracy slowly entered the investigation. Detectives compared financial records. They reviewed contract documents. They examined payment schedules. They searched for evidence suggesting coordinated planning rather than a spontaneous act of violence. The theory appeared plausible. The evidence remained incomplete. Months became years. Witness memories faded. Businesses changed ownership. Equipment was sold. Roads once used daily by logging trucks slowly disappeared beneath vegetation. The case entered what investigators eventually classified as inactive status. It did not disappear. It simply stopped moving. For the families of Harold Mercer, Dennis Avery, Wayne Hollis, Clifford Dunn, Larry Boone, Russell Keene, and Tommy Raines, the passage of time offered little comfort. Anniversaries continued arriving each October. Birthdays passed. Harold never reached the retirement he had quietly planned. Dennis's careful habit of documenting suspicious activity ended with the disappearance of the very camera investigators most wanted to examine. Wayne's final letter home became one of the last personal reminders of a future that never arrived. The investigation became what many communities reluctantly recognize as a cold case. Then, years later, hope unexpectedly returned. According to later investigative accounts, a retired truck driver contacted authorities and stated that he wished to provide information he had never previously disclosed. He reportedly claimed that, on the night of the attack, he had observed armed men traveling toward Camp Hollow Ridge using one of the remote logging roads before later seeing vehicles leave the area under unusual circumstances. Investigators believed his account, if presented under oath and subjected to formal examination, could finally establish a direct connection between long-held suspicions and identifiable individuals. Preparations began. Meetings were scheduled. Evidence was reviewed again with renewed purpose. For the first time in years, investigators believed the case might finally move forward. Then, everything changed. Only days before his scheduled deposition, the retired driver died unexpectedly following what was officially reported as a sudden medical emergency. According to investigators, no evidence suggested criminal involvement in his death. The timing, nevertheless, proved devastating to the case. Without sworn testimony, much of what he had shared informally became significantly more difficult to introduce within future legal proceedings. Investigators attempted to corroborate portions of his account through independent evidence, but after so many years, records had disappeared. Memories conflicted, and physical traces no longer existed. The moment that appeared capable of reopening the investigation collapsed almost overnight. When the case was eventually presented for further prosecutorial review, the evidence remained largely circumstantial. Financial disputes suggested motive. Missing records raised questions. Witnesses recalled tension. Yet the available proof still fell short of establishing criminal responsibility beyond the required legal standard. The grand jury declined to proceed. No charges were filed. Once again, the case returned to silence, carrying with it unanswered questions, missing evidence, and the growing fear that the truth surrounding Camp Hollow Ridge might remain buried as deeply as the forests where 7 men had lost their lives decades earlier. Decades passed before anyone looked at the Hollow Ridge file with fresh eyes. By then, the logging camp had long since disappeared beneath new growth, the gravel. Roads had narrowed into forgotten trails, and many of the people who once spoke about the contract dispute had either moved away or died. The investigation had become little more than several weathered boxes stacked inside a county archive, each one carrying the weight of unanswered questions that most believed would never be resolved. The breakthrough began not with a witness, but with paperwork. As part of a county records modernization project, thousands of aging financial ledgers, property transfers, tax assessments, and commercial filings were scanned into a searchable digital archive. What had once required weeks of manual comparison could suddenly be examined in hours. During that process, investigators noticed timber payments that did not match the contracts preserved in the original case file. Several transfers had been routed through intermediary accounts, before ultimately benefiting individuals who had publicly denied any financial interest in the disputed harvest. The irregularities alone proved very little, but they justified reopening the file. A retired detective who had worked portions of the original investigation volunteered to assist the review. Freed from the pressure of active caseloads and armed with decades of investigative experience, he began comparing every surviving contract, invoice, survey map, and payment record line by line. It was slow work, but the inconsistencies gradually formed a pattern. Property descriptions had been altered, parcel boundaries shifted between filings, timber volumes failed to match recorded deliveries. Investigators concluded that the contract dispute had never been a misunderstanding. It had been carefully engineered. Then another discovery changed everything. While settling the estate of a deceased accountant who had represented several timber businesses during the late 1980s, family members uncovered boxes of archived business documents that had never been cataloged. Inside one folder sat a familiar piece of evidence thought lost forever: Harold Mercer's handwritten load totals. The worn pages matched descriptions provided by former co-workers years earlier. Every shipment had been carefully recorded. Every payment expected under the agreement appeared beside Harold's unmistakably methodical handwriting. More importantly, the notebook documented deliveries that never appeared in the official financial records reviewed during the original investigation. For the first time, investigators possessed independent documentation, showing that substantial profits had been diverted through concealed transactions immediately before the killings. Only weeks later, another remarkable discovery emerged from the evidence archive itself. During a comprehensive inventory of older case property, technicians opened a box that had been mistakenly cataloged decades earlier under unrelated vehicle records. Inside lay several undeveloped rolls of photographic film. The evidence labels matched Dennis Avery. Modern forensic imaging allowed investigators to recover photographs that had remained unseen for years. Dennis had unknowingly documented far more than damaged equipment and suspicious tire tracks. Several images captured distinctive pickup trucks parked near restricted logging roads in the days before the attack. Others showed fresh tire impressions crossing Dennis's familiar mountain shortcut, the same route he drove each morning because he trusted routine more than chance. When investigators compared those photographs with surviving registration records, ownership histories, and archived insurance files, vehicles previously dismissed as insignificant suddenly became central pieces of the investigation: the mountain shortcut. Dennis followed every morning also explained something investigators had never fully understood. It offered the most concealed approach to Camp Hollow Ridge. The attackers had likely used the same route he knew so well. Further review uncovered fraudulent land transfers connected to the disputed timber rights, hidden ownership agreements, shell companies, and falsified accounting records revealed that the conflict had never been about a single logging contract. It had been about protecting a profitable scheme that depended upon silence. This time, the evidence reached a different conclusion. Charges were finally filed. The indictments alleged conspiracy, financial fraud, and 7 counts of murder against the surviving participants identified. Through the renewed investigation, the individual investigators believed had organized the operation died before trial, ending any possibility of a courtroom verdict against him. The remaining defendants, however, faced years of documented financial records, recovered business files, and photographs that investigators argued connected motive, planning, and opportunity. After a lengthy trial, jurors returned guilty verdicts. For the families of Harold Mercer, Dennis Avery, Wayne Hollis, Clifford Dunn, Larry Boone, Russell Keene, and Tommy Raines, no verdict could restore the years that had been taken from them. Harold never enjoyed the retirement he had planned so carefully. Dennis never developed the photographs he believed might matter someday. Wayne's final letter remained the last promise he would ever send home. Yet the answers they had sought for decades finally existed in the open. The forests surrounding Hollow Ridge remained as quiet as they had always been. Wind still moved through the hardwood trees. Old logging roads continued disappearing beneath leaves and brush. Time had hidden the camp itself, but it had failed to erase the paper trail left behind by ordinary people who believed that careful records mattered. In the end, it was not a dramatic confession or a forgotten weapon that broke the silence. It was a notebook, a roll of film, and a ledger that refused to forget. Not because the forest remembered, but because the records did.